Okay, we didn't get started too late. Um, so I guess there's no questions. I didn't hear anyone making any noise. So let's see, where do we get it? How do we get here? Wait, hang on a second. Pulled up the wrong one. Switch them here. Actually, this. Okay. First, you should have gotten, or at least in Canvas, there should be. I think I've got. I forgot if I put two little videos or one in there. There should be a couple of videos on remittance, the remittance system, and that, and to a certain extent, modern production migration is sort of tied to a related episode in sort of different ways. In fact, outsourcing definitely. And it's a part of the world that you guys are familiar with because it's part of the world now. But it really didn't exist in many ways the way you see it now until about 30 or 40 years ago. And when you look at both especially outsourcing and remittance systems both, are really dependent on a whole set of technical issues, which didn't exist prior till quite recently. And these would be, among other things, high-speed internet. You can't have outsourcing where a group of people sitting at a phone bank in Mumbai in India or in are basically answering phones for people trying to make reservations, say in Honolulu, or having trouble with their Mac and they need to have some sort of computer assistance. You need to have high-speed, reliable communications before you can do that. And you couldn't do that prior to, basically around 20 years ago, because you had some high-speed communications, but they were so incredibly expensive that you just couldn't afford to do it. So outsourcing requires the internet to the main part. And so outsourcing, which some of you guys are familiar with, if you're ever in a situation where you're trying to get sort of like a help desk, what you're going to find is in most cases that help desk is actually somewhere else on planet Earth. And for most computer systems, it's actually in Mumbai in India is where that's sent to. Now, there's a weird part of that that sort of has to do with this idea of, again, of sort of different types of labor. India, despite the stereotype, is actually the world's largest English-speaking country. So there's more people speaking English in India than anywhere else in the world. And what that means is, as long as English is the language that a lot of people are trying to communicate in, and if for example, they want help with a computer, English is how they want that explained to them. Then it's a great situation. If that changes, right now Putonghua or Mandarin is actually the world's most common internet-based language. If that grows more so, then all of a sudden you wouldn't find outsourcing in places like India to the same extent, because there's very few people in India, probably almost none, that speak Chinese. So outsourcing is oftentimes tied to weird situations. In the case of India, as we'll soon get into politics, it's actually tied to the fact that for 200 years, most of India was under British control, and the British made everyone in India learn English. So while the Indians hated that in the 18th and 19th century, by the end of the 20th century, the 21st century, it's turned out to be really useful. Same thing in the Philippines. The United States takes the Philippines over as a colonial possession in 1899 and pretty much keeps that way till after World War II. So for 2 generations, you have populations that basically, if they go to school, they're taught English. They didn't necessarily like it, but what it meant is all of a sudden in the 21st century, you got a large population that's bilingual. If something were to happen, all of a sudden Americans had to, for example, speak Italian. If they wanted to do outsourcing, then that just wouldn't happen. Most Americans aren't bilingual. So what you find is oftentimes the colonial past, or actually sort of the heritage of a place, gives them actually in the modern world, oftentimes it's sort of a leg up or a step up in terms of, being competitive, in terms of providing, you know, people for different types of activities. And to a certain extent, the outsourcing and remittances are in some ways almost different versions, or sort of they're different, but they're related to each other too. So if you look at remittance systems, and again, I've seen this mainly in Hong Kong. My in-laws in Hong Kong actually have, I assume they still do, I haven't been back there in more than a couple of years. They have a Filipino driver. They have a Filipino maid. When the girls were younger, they had a Filipino nanny. So within a population of 5 Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, I think the total in the household was 7 Filipino workers. It's very typical, if you're just middle-class Chinese in Hong Kong, to have at least 1 Filipino servant, in the sense of a maid or a nanny or whatever the family wants or needs. And all these are recruited by massive labor agencies that are actually in the Philippines. So someone in the Philippines needs a job, they contact these labor agencies, and they basically give, well, here's your options or something like that. And then, next thing they find themselves living in Hong Kong for maybe, 5, 10, 15 years. I think the driver, I was asking him once, he's been in Hong Kong for almost 20 years. He still sends money home every week to his family. And I don't know where his family is. I'm going to say Baguio. I'm not sure where his family's from. But that's an example of a remittance system. You're actually, if you think about it, you can either move the job to a place. So you can move the Hawaiian Airlines call center from Honolulu to Manila. So you actually move the activity to another location. The people that are doing that live in Manila and just go to work every day. Or what you can do is, with very much the same system, you can take someone like me and then actually have them go somewhere else in the world to follow the word. So in both cases, what you're doing is you're fitting people to work situations where they are cheaper. Maybe they're better workers or whatever, but you're chasing them around versus, the call center here, traditionally the Hawaiian Airlines had in Honolulu, hired local folks here to work in that call center. And so therefore their labor costs, as I think I mentioned last time, were pretty significant. When they shipped it to Manila, they told me that their labor costs went down by 80%. So they basically could get 5 hours, they could get 5 hours out of someone in Manila that 30 minutes would be in Honolulu in terms of what they were paying them in terms of wages. So in that situation, that was why outsourcing made sense to them. Did they need to do it? Probably not. Were they making more money by the time it was done? Sure. So remittance and outsourcing are sort of part of the same thing. You've got cheap labor, and you've got a need, and what you're doing is you're either doing that through the internet or you're actually physically moving people around. Now, there's another part that you need to have, and this is again the internet also. If you're going to do outsourcing or remittance systems, you have to have a fast internet, but you also, and probably more importantly, this is one of the other things that really doesn't get talked about very much at all, is you have to have international banking. If you go back even to the, say, World War II period, so say, 70 years ago, you had banks that belonged to countries. There's the Bank of France, for example, that was the French National Bank. There's the Bank of England, which I think is still the British National Bank. There's a Bank of Scotland. The United States had a bunch of banks, but other countries generally had one bank. Deutsche Bank, for example, was the German bank. And what that meant is that in the country, that bank ran all the stuff that was going on in the country, but they pretty much didn't have any control outside of the country. So for example, if I have money here and I want to send it to relatives in France, I would have to use an American bank, and they would have to send it to the French National Bank. And at that point, they would convert it to French, francs, to French currency, and then send it to my relatives. By the last half of the 20th century, that changes. All of a sudden, banking then becomes international. So what you find is that today, banks aren't what they appear to be. Bank of America, for example, isn't actually an American bank at all. It's a huge international conglomerate. One of my relatives used to work for HSBC, which is Hong Kong Shanghai banking complex, which was originally based in Shanghai in China and also in Hong Kong. Now their headquarters are in London. So on one hand, they used to be a Hong Kong bank. Now 80% of their business has nothing to do with China or Hong Kong. And this is true of most large banks. Most banks now are global. And they also have a system where they interact with each other, so they can literally move money around in milliseconds. Now, among other things, what this means is there's been a huge change in how this works. So for example, if we go back 100 years ago here, and we'll say that someone's is a Filipino worker from northern part of Luzon is working at the plantation in IS, so they're working at the IML. The main reason they're here is to send money back to the family in the Philippines. So they would go to some place, some bank here, get a money draft, sort of like a check, and then they'd put that into an envelope and send it to their relatives in the Philippines, who would then have to take it to a particular type of bank in the Philippines to cash it. You can still see this a little bit. Some of you might be familiar with this with your relatives, where they have to use Western Union to send money around. That's the leftover. That's sort of like the appendix or the tail of the leftover bit of that old system. That used to be the only way you could send money about. And Western Union's business was sending money between countries, which no one else could do. Nowadays, all the banks do that. All banks can move money all over the place, and this is why if you guys were to go travel to Tokyo next week or something like that, you could literally use your credit cards in most cases. You could go into one of the giant banks in Japan, like Sumitomo, for example, and just go and take your credit card in and get cash out there on the spot. They would just go into the internet, check what your status is in Hawaii, and then figure out whether you had enough money to do it or not. So this is something that's only occurred in the last 40 or 50 years. So once you have the ability to move money internationally safely, then all of a sudden outsourcing makes sense, because now a company in Hawaii like Hawaiian Airlines actually has the folks in the Philippines on their payroll. So they're actually employees in the Philippines. Their HR department here goes and fills out the forms and sends the whatever they're getting paid to whatever bank they're using in the Philippines. And that happens in a microsecond. In a remittance system, if you're working in Dubai, or for example, if I'm a driver in Hong Kong and I'm sending money back to the family in the Philippines, then literally I just go into HSBC or one of the other Hong Kong banks, and in a microsecond it's transferred to my account or my family's account in Manila or whatever it is, and they've got access to it. And I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to go someplace and get a piece of paper and send it by the mail and hope they don't lose it or the dog eats it or something like that. So remittance and outsourcing are only possible when you have global telecommunications and financial systems which are global. And those have only existed for 40 or 50 years. And we're not really sure what the ramifications are. Because one of the side effects of having a Bank of England, till recently, was that they're the folks that print the money. So the English pound, which is their currency, was printed by that bank. And so the government and the bank were actually part of the same system. The bank was actually almost part of the government. So the government would tell the bank, okay, we need to print, $50 million, pounds worth of money. The bank would go, okay. And the government would invest its money in the bank. The bank would be how you paid people, would be through the bank. So there was this sort of, intimate relationship between a banking industry and a particular country. So banks were part of the sovereign system of a country. When all of a sudden banks have become global, now all of a sudden you find situations where, in fact, this became a huge issue back in 07, 08, you remember when you were kids, and the whole banking industry just absolutely tanked overnight. That was because banks had become global. And at that point, governments suddenly realized they couldn't control them. Right now, for example, if the US government said that it wanted to change the investment practices of banks in the United States, like Bank of America or Wells Fargo, the banks could tell them no, and there's nothing the government could do. The banks actually control the financial status of the world, not the governments. So this is one of the enormous changes just from the time that you guys basically were in like kindergarten, is the fact that now we're in a world where the banking industry and banking investments are actually separate from government control. So they're not subject to government control. They're not subject to like United Nations control. They pretty much get to do whatever they want to. And there's very little you can do about that because we've become entirely dependent on a global banking system. And this becomes the World Bank. If you want to Google that up, there's just the amount of discussion about that particular organization, just it's legion. But there's actually a global organization of the leading investment banks that decide where they're going to put money in the world and what places they won't. And they literally can drive a country into bankruptcy in a couple of minutes because they can suddenly decide that they don't want to give any loans to, for example, Indonesia. And they don't want to, for example, they're going to call in all the money that's due from Indonesia, call in all the stuff, and that's it. All of a sudden, Indonesia wouldn't be on the charts; it wouldn't exist financially. They're just like all their money would be useless paper. So this is something that's an enormous change. The governments are still trying to figure out what actually happens. What happens when you no longer control financial sectors, when financial sectors are now global entities that aren't subject to national or local or even regional controls? Something that Marx never, never occurred in the world he lived in. But it's certainly a part of outsourcing and remittance systems. Yeah, so if you want to look at this, a huge complicated situation about how Dubai pays or doesn't pay the people who work in Dubai, which has to do with how they play games with global banking and the remittance systems, which is pretty surreal and not very ethical, but they're making a lot of money out of it. The other part of this would be production migration. Did I send you guys, I'm sure no one watched it yet, did I send you guys the video on coffee in Guatemala? Is that in Canvas? Sorry, I'm being lazy. I don't have Canvas up right now. Oh, wait. I have to let me check. Come here, get out of the way. I'm trying to remember what I sent you guys. I was sending a bunch of stuff out in another class too. Yeah, okay. When you get a chance, there's a video for you guys to do a reaction on called Guatemala coffee. Watch that one within this context of labor, because that's probably one of the really striking examples of that whole process of labor demands and how that plays out in terms of production migration. So what you have in this production migration occurs in two ways. The obvious one would be if you're in a country which doesn't have a lot of money available or a lot of jobs, is you move to a place that has jobs, and that you'll actually see in the Guatemala video. Whereas coffee prices have collapsed, so all of a sudden if you're a coffee farmer, you can't make any money. It makes sense to actually sneak across the border in the United States where there's jobs and there's money. So illegal immigration is oftentimes tied to production migration. Illegal immigration from North Africa, for example, to Italy, Spain, and other European countries is an example of production, sort of reverse migration, in the sense that what you have is populations leaving their home country because there's no work and moving to places where there's a potential for work. But it also works the other way around. And an example right now that's really sort of caught the Chinese totally off guard is that starting in the 1970s and 1980s, China advertised itself as the cheap place in the world to move a factory. If you moved a factory to China, the Chinese government would give you a really good rate in terms of the land. The labor was obscenely cheap. And so you basically could make something for maybe 1/5 or 1/10 what the cost would be to make it, say, in the United States. So Apple, for example, by the mid and late 1980s, moved all the production of all their Apple products from the United States to China, largely through a company called Foxconn, which makes the parts for iPhones, for example, and also iPads. So they were all based in China. And what that was is that was moving your factories to a place where people who work in the factory are a lot cheaper than the place you had before. So you're chasing the cheap labor. Now, for some reason, I'm not sure why, except they weren't really thinking this through, the Chinese thought that was going to be that way forever. But the reality, what happens is, of course, is that in the case of China, since most of the Foxconn factories are actually near Hong Kong, they're in Shenzhen, is the factories that were built there, people went and moved to those factories, and they went and worked in the factories, and they were making money in the factories, and they would start to push for higher wages because they were working really hard, and they were making good stuff, and so they get paid a little bit more. And as they got paid a little bit more, they wanted a little bit more. And so what happened is your labor costs started to go like this up in Chinese factories. By about 15 years ago, as the Chinese labor cost was slowly creeping, it didn't shoot up, like just like creeping up bit by bit by bit, is all of a sudden other countries around China realized that they could actually now compete with the Chinese because their labor was cheaper. And the big player in this was Malaysia and Vietnam, especially Vietnam, which basically then told the guys like Foxconn, which is actually ironically a Chinese company, they said, here you've got this factory in China that's making iPhones. If you go and move that iPhone factory here to Vietnam, we can guarantee that your labor costs will only be half what you're paying the guys in China. Now remember, the Chinese guys are still maybe 1/10 as expensive as the American ones. But now if you're Foxconn, you can move, even though you're a Chinese company, most of Foxconn's factories, even though they're Chinese, are now in Vietnam. The reason being that same factory, they could literally just take the parts of the factory, put them in a box, ship them to Vietnam, build the factory there, and save a ton of money in labor cost. So what's been happening, especially in the last 40 or 50 years, and again because of telecommunications, If I'm a manager of a factory, or if I'm Apple, I don't care where the factory is. I just tell them I need 10,000 iPhones by next week. I don't care what country it's in. I just need the damn phones. So in that situation, what you get is this becomes the way that this gets played out. China right now is losing production like this. Foxconn, for example, has entirely left China, which has pissed the Chinese government off a lot. Because here's one of the major Chinese manufacturers, which has just actually left China, and their argument is legitimately from their standpoint, labor's a lot cheaper in Vietnam. And since I only make iPhones, when I can guarantee to Apple I'll make them cheaper than anyone else, then I've got to go where the labor's the cheapest so I can make some money too. So what's happening globally is production is moving around really fast from one country to another. There's factories outside of, according to a friend of mine, there's factories outside of Shenzhen where they built the factory in China to do, I can't remember what, it was, solar panels. They were going to build the solar panels in China. They built the factory, got ready to open it, and then shut it down because they found that they could build the solar panels in India for half the price. So the concrete wasn't even dry, the paint wasn't even dry on the factory, and they had already moved it to another country to do the same thing all over again because they could save money. In the modern world of combination of robotic, factory data systems and the internet and all that, it's incredibly easy to move a factory from one spot to another. And in that, what happens is places like China that made their entire world in the last 30 years on making everything. The classic American stereotype is still that if you buy anything at Walmart, it's from China. Well, the reality is about a third of the stuff in Walmart in the last 10 years is now from Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. It's not from China anymore. So what's happening is as production's moving, what's the problem that makes for China? They had all these factories, all of a sudden these factories are just literally shutting down one after the other. If I'm the Chinese government, why am I really, 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 one, unhappy, and two, starting to panic?
That's like wasted resources or wasted effort.
Yeah, I've got all these empty factories, and I have no idea what the hell you turn an empty factory into. But even more scary, a normal Foxconn factory, I actually visited one back about 15 years ago in Shenzhen. It had these huge dorms. I think they had 20,000 people in the dorms. There were 3 factories, and the factories actually employed about 25,000 people. So if you want to put that, that'd be the entire population from Hawaii Kai all the way out to Waikiki was employed in these factories. Now, these factories have now moved to Vietnam. Now, what's the problem if you're the government in Shenzhen? Well, actually, let's put it more in the immediate context. We'll say that all you guys graduate from Shanghai. Congratulations, you know, grad. And you all get jobs, and there's some new factory that's doing something. We're making, I don't know, robots. So you guys all get jobs working on the assembly line in a robot factory here in Honolulu, and you're making pretty good money, so you're sort of happy. Well, no, I mean, we'll make it so these jobs showed up, but you've got to take them now. So you all decide that since the money's really good, that you'll make maybe about 70, 80 grand a year. So you'll drop out of Chaminade, quit college, and go work on the assembly line. Okay. It's now 6 years later, and you guys have had 6 years of this. You've been making money. You got a down payment on an apartment in Kaka'ako or whatever like that, and you're all good to go. And all of a sudden, one morning, there's a little notice posted on the door, and pop, the factory's moved to Indonesia. Okay. What's the problem that you guys have?
Out of a job.
Okay, yeah, the most obvious one is you're out of a job. What's the other problem, which actually sort of sounds like the very thing that we're talking about with COVID right now? Okay, so now this is all hypothetical, so don't panic. But you're all out of a job now. What's the problem you've got starting tomorrow?
You have like no money or like no plan.
Yeah, you have no plan, no money, and to a certain extent, you don't have any particular educational expertise because guess what? You quit your education because there was this great jobs list line there. So what you know how to do is bolt the arms on a robot. But you don't have any what we call transferable job skills. Now, I'll say that one of you, say that Emily or someone like that is actually in the business. She's one of the ones that was actually coding what the robots did. So she might be able to actually move to Indonesia and get a job at that new plant doing the coding because they don't have to teach someone new. The rest of you folks are just flat out of luck. Because what happened is the skills that you had were so focused on that particular assembly line doing those particular things that you really have no job skills that are usable in anything other than that factory and doing that particular thing. Now, I think we won't see it till a couple of weeks, but if you ever you can want to look at it in advance, go Google or go YouTube Gary, Indiana. If you go to our sister school in Dayton, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio is where they used to make almost all the, I think it was brake parts for cars in the United States. And you can drive through the downtown section. There's literally just block after block of these huge, beautiful brick factories, 2- and 3-story factories that have been empty now for like 20 or 30 years because they don't make a single car part in Dayton, Ohio, not for anything. I don't think they make bicycle parts in Dayton. So all these factories are gone and all those jobs are gone. And a large part of the population in Dayton, Ohio basically never graduated from high school. At age 15 or 16, they'd go and work at the factory where their dad was working or something like that because they could get a job. The job paid really, really well. In fact, it paid better than if you went into college. So you were making more money starting than you would be after 4 years of college. So people didn't even bother finishing high school. So all of a sudden, we'll say it's now 1990, so let's say 20, 30 years ago, and all of a sudden that factory leaves. And you've got a bunch of people who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s that don't even have a high school diploma, who now have to figure out what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. And like Kayla mentioned, they've got mortgages to pay. They've got kids they want to put through school. They got all those other expenses are still there, but they got absolutely squat in job skills because at the time when they were making that choice, it would be really stupid to get a college education if you could make more money and drop out as a junior in high school. Why the hell would you bother to go to college unless you want to be a teacher or something like that? And even then, you weren't going to make as much. So in that context, this is the problem you get into when you get into cheap labor. No matter how cheap one place's labor is, some place is always going to be able to outbid you. Okay? And so what's happening in China is not only did they lose the factories, so now got all those empty spaces, they've also lost the jobs that are attached to them. And most of the Chinese workforce went from being a farmer one day to working on an assembly line the other day. And just, we won't get into it, it's not part of this class, but many Chinese in that age group, especially from their 50s or older, never finished high school because for a period of time into the 1970s, there was no school in China. They shut down all the schools for about 15 years. So a lot of folks working in that assembly line were literate, but they probably went to basically, if they were lucky, they maybe finished the 8th grade. So if they're 50 years old now, they've got absolutely nothing to offer to a potential employer. If they tried to fill out a LinkedIn page, I don't know what the hell they'd put on it. You know, I speak Chinese and I know how to farm, but I quit doing that when I was 16. And I've worked in Foxcom's factory and I know every part of the speaker system on an iPhone. Well, that makes you really employable. You know, that's about like the most useless set of job skills on planet Earth. That's the problem with production migration. If a country depends upon being that cheap production base and they get outbid by somewhere else, this is what Vietnam's done. They've outbid China. Now China's looking at millions of people being unemployed who were employed just a couple of years ago. And they're not employable because there's nothing they have to offer, you know, a company that would hire them. You know, they're just there. They're just mouths that need to be fed. And of course, what that also means, and I think this is what Kayla started getting at, is all the money those guys had as salaries that was going into taxes, or they're going to their version of 7-Eleven, or they're buying lunch. All of a sudden, their version of St. Louis Drive-In or WM Burgers is now out of business because there's no one going down there to buy lunch because no one has a job because the factory's all closed. And that's what happened, according to a friend of mine, that's what happened around that huge Foxconn facility in Shenzhen. The factories are empty. The dorms are empty, which means you've got these 20-story high dorms with literally, you know, thousands of rooms in them each that are now totally empty and no one knows what to do with them. And they're in great shape. They're not that old. But also you've lost all the stores around outside are now gone. They've all gone bankrupt. All the markets and restaurants have gone bankrupt. all the folks that used to ship food or other stuff into these guys are all gone bankrupt. And the IT firms that used to help support the system, they've gone bankrupt. So it's like a bomb going off. There's not only this part where it blew up, it's also like this ripple effect around that's just absolutely destroyed a lot of the economic system in that part. And among other things, now there's no tax money coming in. So the government doesn't have any money to, for example, fix the roads or do anything. So apparently what my friend was saying is if you go around there, the roads look like, the roads are starting to literally fall apart. Why? Because there's no one working there. So there's no money to go and patch the roads up. So the whole place is literally biodegrading as it goes. And if you're familiar with that part of China, things biodegrade down there really fast. So he figures within 15 years, you could probably use it for some post-apocalyptic movie, busting up places and green shit growing out of windows and all sorts of neat stuff like that. But as far as a place where literally thousands and thousands of people are making lots and lots of money, it's gone. And right now it doesn't seem any way it's going to come back. So the problem with production migration is there's always, if you're going to migrate the factory rather than people, you can always migrate. Nowadays you can migrate factories really, really easily. And one of the creepy things he pointed out, apparently it's actually become a major pastime for folks in Shenzhen, is in a lot of these factories, guys like Foxconn actually leave all the factory equipment in the factory. And I was asking him why, and he said, well, that's because the equipment's 10 years old. So if you got 10-year-old equipment making iPhones, that would have been what, an iPhone 2 or 3? I don't know what it was 10 years ago, whatever. It's way down the numbers. So if you're the Foxconn factory in Vietnam and you're going to build iPhone 12s, what makes more sense rather than moving the equipment from China? Build new equipment for the Vietnamese plant. It's going to be a lot more efficient. It's 10 years younger. It can have robots integrated into it. And it's going to be building a new phone anyways. So what the hell do you want equipment that was, good a decade ago? That's useless. So when the guys leave the factory, they literally abandon it. They probably lock the doors and that's it. They probably don't take anything out at all. They just get up and leave, take a plane and end up in Hanoi next week. So production migration is really sort of scary because it makes the global system really unstable. The companies are still making money. They're making more money every time they find a cheaper labor pool. But from a place that was doing stuff, they'll suddenly find themselves they're not competitive anymore. And this is why you have what we now call the Rust Belt. Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, Ohio, all your Midwestern states were the production center for the United States. Now they don't produce anything. So there's tens of thousands of people out of work. There's places, whole towns that are basically abandoned. And it's pretty gnarly if you go to some place like, say, Columbus, Ohio. And no one knows what to do about it because you've got a bunch of largely unemployable people. And even if they wanted to do something other than working at a McDonald's or something like that, there's no jobs available. And if you think about it for a second, if I've got a job and I'm making, say if I worked on an assembly line at, say, an American manufacturing plant 20 years ago, I would have been making probably about $85 to $90 an hour. And that's back, say, 10 years ago when money was a lot better. So I'd be making somewhere in the range of about $100,000 a year. I'm bringing home with less than a high school education. Now, if that leaves, and all the jobs like that leave, if that production sector leaves, and all of a sudden I have a choice, I can work at Target, I can work at Walmart or McDonald's. Okay. And we'll say I'm 50 years old. Why am I going to be somewhere way beyond an unhappy camper? How much does Walmart pay here? Anyone know? It's still just barely double digits. I believe their starting salary is it's either $9.40 or $10.10, but that's with no health coverage. So that's gross. And if you want to do anything, if you pay the health coverage, I think that takes almost a third of your salary away from you right off the bat. So if you want to figure sort of like a regular job, you're making basically about $7 an hour, which means if you figure out at the end of the year, you'd be bringing home, I believe it comes out to about $24,000. So I was making 100 grand. Now I'm making less than a quarter of that. So at that point, I'm not really that enthused working for Walmart. You know, and if someone, one of you is, if Kayla's their HR, she's not going to hire me. You know, you can imagine me being the guy standing at the door saying, "Welcome to Walmart." It's going to be like, you guys, you know, everything going to get everyone pissed off. They can afford to shop at Walmart. I work there and I can't afford to shop there. So, you know, I'm not going to be a happy camper. I'm not going to be a good person to make a smiley face and be good customer relations at a place when I'm all the time thinking about the job I used to have, which made 4 times as much. Okay. So production migration has all sorts of sort of ancillary side effects on the places that lose the production. And the United States is a classic example. We've lost almost all of our production in the United States. We've lost all our production here in Hawaii. We produce absolutely nothing in the Hawaiian Islands anymore. And one of the side effects then is all of a sudden a group of people who are making really good money suddenly find themselves completely off the economic chart. And not surprisingly, they get very upset about that, which is a lot of sort of the current political discussion in the United States, is folks that don't see jobs available and can't understand why those jobs are gone, why I can't find a job, why I need to have this or that in this day and age. And, you know, the funny thing is Americans complain about lack of jobs. You're hearing the same discussion now in China, which is what the Americans blame the Chinese for stealing all the jobs. Well, the Chinese had them, but the Chinese lost them. They got stolen from them too. So it's just a very it's a very simple situation, but it gets really complicated when you look at sort of the implications of it, as with a lot of this stuff. Okay, the last of these issues, let's see if I can pop this up here. This is probably one of the more unusual technical terms. This was one of the big negotiating points in the last couple of years when the United States tried to renegotiate the relationship with Canada and Mexico. These are what we call regional trade agreements. The first one, the most famous, would be the European Union. So if we decided, what are you going to, I don't know why, we're going to take a field trip to Europe this semester, congratulations. So we go over there. One thing you're going to find, as long as we stay out of England, which is a little confusing right now, if we land in Paris, for example, we have to have an American passport and we have to have our visas. But if we decide that we're going to start in Paris and we're going to go to Berlin in Germany, and then we're going to go down to, I say Milan in Italy, and then we're going to go to Barcelona in Spain, we don't need to have our passport stamped. You're not going to have anyone stopping you at a border and wanting to ask you if you want to come into the country. The European Union is now a single, in some ways, is a single country. It's got a single passport. So you don't have an Italian passport or a French passport, you have an EU passport. They use a single currency, the EU, the European dollar. They have, to a certain extent, somewhat the same legal system in all the areas. Now that means if you're in Europe, it's fantastic. You can literally, and I've done this, you can jump on a train in Paris, you can end up in Italy and go through Switzerland. And, you know, you don't even stop at the border. You go to sleep in the afternoon in Paris and you wake up early the next morning and you're in Milan. You've gone through 3 countries. No customs, no immigration, no one checking your baggage, zip. As long as you got checked when you came into the European Union, it's just like one giant country. It's like going from Nevada to California. I mean, you know, who gives a rat's ass what you do? So these are these regional trade unions. The European Union was the first. It was by far the most successful. And with that, what happened is other parts of the world realized if they didn't do something like that, they were going to get hammered because the EU basically could leverage a whole mess of countries and their resources and their skills into basically what sort of acted like a country. So the United States, Canada, and Mexico decided they were going to do the same thing. And this was called NAFTA, North American Free Trade Association. So the 3 countries set it up so that basically goods, resources, money, and everything could move fairly freely between all 3 countries. Now, it didn't include anyone further south. It stopped at the Mexican border here. But basically, Mexico, the United States, and Canada would allow movement of resources, goods, people, etc., with almost no controls between the 3. And that way, what you could do is you could manufacture stuff, for example, here, and sell in the United States and Canada without any punishment. It wasn't seen as being foreign. Now, one of the odder aspects of this is because unlike the Europeans, the folks in the North American region really didn't trust each other and really don't have that close a relationship, especially the United States and Mexico isn't that close, is that there was a lot of sort of distrust about whether this is actually going to work. So what they decided in some sort of odd version, I have no idea why they decided this. You have to go back and look at your history books. They decided to basically take this 100-mile line here, which is sort of like, here's the line, here's the border between Mexico and the US.
Oh, we can't see.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I forgot. Good point. I forgot to switch the share here. Okay, here we go. So now you got it. So here's the border between Mexico and the US. Okay. What they decided to do is they take this area basically on this side where the hand's moving. This whole area here that's in Mexico, but it's just south of the American border. It's basically between 100 and 150 miles into Mexico. And decided what they were going to call this. Let me see this right here. For example, here's Mexico. Anything in this area was called part of the Maquiladora, which is in Mexican just means border region in Mexican, in Spanish. And what the deal was is anything that's done here. So for example, if I'm Harley Davidson, the motorcycle guys, they moved their big plant down here. So they moved the plant into Mexico. Now what that meant is that the wages they paid are Mexican wages. The pollution and environmental laws are Mexican laws, which are pretty much non-existent. So all of a sudden they were able to save themselves a ton of money making motorcycles. If they sold the motorcycles made within here, as long as it's within that region, they can advertise they're made in the United States. So if you ever buy a motorcycle, the only company that actually makes motorcycles in the United States is Honda. They make them in a plant in Pennsylvania. Harley Davidson, all the other American motorcycle manufacturers are actually made in Mexico, which is sort of ironic when the way that people like to use Harley as an image of being an American thing. They're totally not. They're made in Mexico. The workforce speaks Spanish. But because of this agreement of the three countries in this border region, this maquiladoras, anything down here can be sold in the United States as if it was made in the United States. So immediately, a huge part of American production moved from places like Phoenix or wherever in the U.S. and just moved on the other side of this border, and all of a sudden, bang, their world just became really, really easy and really, really simple, because now all of a sudden their labor costs disappeared. Their issue about pollution regulations, or for example HR in terms of risk, danger in the workplace, totally non-existent. So a large part of what still is seen as American production that people buy and it says made in the U.S. actually is made in the Mexican side of the U.S. border. Now, when they renegotiated this in the last couple of years, when the United States decided they didn't like the NAFTA agreement, so it came up with a new agreement, which I can't remember what it's called right now. What they did is they had to keep that in place because the American companies basically said, if you suddenly say this is Mexico again, we're bankrupt. And so, for example, Harley, among other companies, said, if you decide to change that agreement, we're moving to China. And so there was this huge hoo. You might remember Trump, for example, was all railing about Harley Davidson being un-American and traitors and stuff like that. That was because the government was going to change this arrangement. So in the end, the government backed down. So Harleys are still made in Mexico, and Harleys are still sold as being made in the United States. A lot of clothes that you buy that say made in the U.S. actually aren't. They're made in Mexico. But as long as they're within that border region, they fall under Mexican laws, Mexican labor laws, Mexican security laws, a lot of type of stuff. But it's still seen as a way to keep money closer to the United States and keep manufacturers in this area. It's one of the weirder aspects. I don't know of any place else that did that. So somehow it just seems very American to do something like that, if you're familiar with American business practice. So yeah, next time you buy something that says made in the USA, good luck on that one. So this is what we call the maquiladoras. It's really interesting just from the standpoint of an example of the odd way that again, labor demands, labor pressures, and the modern world system work. Fair trade. Have you guys ever heard of fair trade? Did that ever come up in like high school or anything? Have you ever seen any ads or anything discussing fair trade at all? How much is a little bit? Not very much, it doesn't look like. I don't see anyone exactly jumping up and down. Okay. There's actually, this is an interesting process. It started up about 15, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. I'm not really too sure. I'm trying to think of when I first heard. I think it was first heard about 20 years ago. And it was initially, it didn't work very well. Then they finally came up, there's actually an international non-governmental, there's an NGO that actually does fair trade certification. In fact, two anthropologists I know quit their regular jobs at universities and they now work for that group. They make really good money. I don't know how you find out who these guys are, but if you can get a job there, it's good bucks. It's paid for in part by the United Nations, I think. But anyways, fair trade movement was an argument that if you wanted to stop, and you'll see this when you watch the coffee video, the Guatemala coffee video, if you want to stop the movement of people from a place where production's cheap, or I should say labor's cheap, but also jobs are limited, and you have another place where there's more jobs that are available, and so you've got a bunch of people moving to another place, and we'll say it's illegal immigration, which it usually is. In that situation, you can either sit there and you can do the current American government things, which you build bigger and bigger walls, spend more and more money on the borders, and you just literally at gunpoint try to keep people out. That's usually remarkably ineffective because at some point you can actually take up a fair amount of your national income just trying to keep people out of a country, especially a country, say, the size of the United States with a 2,000-mile border. The other way that actually makes a fair amount of sense, which they finally came up with in the 70s and 80s, since there was a lot of this problem happening in places like Europe, Turkish populations trying to get into Europe, was that you could make the situation in the home area better so that people didn't feel the need to go somewhere else to make some money. Because almost everyone that moves illegally somewhere else doesn't want to move. They're not moving there because they suddenly want to live in San Diego, for example. They're only moving there because there's no jobs available back home, and if they want to feed their family, they're going to have to go somewhere else to do it. So if you remove that incentive, then they're not going to feel the need to try to crawl across the border. So this was the fair trade logic. And so what they came up with is that the countries that had gazillion dollars, and the United States is a classic example, by far the world's wealthiest company, as you remember that, since most of you already watched it, that garbage video, we're really good at consuming stuff. We're the world's masters of it. What they pointed out is basically if you told Americans, would you donate money to help folks in Latin America, so that they'd stay home, people will say no. If on the other hand, would you tell people, would you pay 20 cents more for a tin of coffee, if that'll make folks in Guatemala stay in Guatemala and not come in the United States, then people will generally tell you yes. Now, as we get into in a second, that doesn't work out that way, but that was the thought. So the attitude is if you raise the prices a little bit in the United States and you made sure that all that money that the price went up didn't go into profit, but instead went back to the person that actually did the work. So there was more equity between the person doing the work and the person consuming the thing. Then what it was going to make is the person doing the work more liable to stay at home because they now make enough money to make rent. So that's the fair trade movement. It's exactly what it says. If I'm a consumer and I'm buying something, if I buy something that's labeled fair trade, it means that the person at the other end that's making this thing is getting a larger proportion of what I'm paying for it. So therefore, they're making more money, and since they live in a place where generally the cost of living is left, now they can actually make enough money to stay home versus trying to sneak across the border into LA or something like that. That's the fair trade movement. It's actually quite popular in Europe. The Europeans were the big ones to do this. If you go to a European market, you can find all sorts of stuff that's fair trade. There's a set of logos they use on products that actually are fair trade. It's like a certification logo. I can't remember what the icon looks like. But people in Europe are very conscientious about buying stuff like that because their attitude is if you buy stuff like that, it's going to keep someone from another country trying to get into my country. I'm willing to pay a little bit more to give them the money directly rather than have them try to show up on my doorstep now because I can find a job in my country. In the United States, it actually worked fairly well around the year 2000. It was really popular for a while. Within about 5 or 6 years, it sort of dropped off the charts. I don't remember the last time you even saw any sort of an ad or anything even mentioning fair trade. And the fact that you guys haven't heard about it is not surprising. It's something that should be brought up in the schools. It should be part of the educational system because when you get in the habit as a teenager, then you're more liable to be aware of it as you get older. So the fair trade certification system basically means that if you go into a store and you buy something, it's got the fair trade certificate. So if you go to Whole Foods, for example, a few things at Whole Foods still are listed as fair trade. It means that wherever that thing was originally made, a little bit of what you're paying the Whole Foods guys for will go directly back to that farmer or that person making that product. And they'll be making a lot more than they would if they had to go through some sort of a factory that basically screwed them into the ground. And that's what the fair trade, if you want to, it's like an equity thing. the person that has the money to buy things is giving a little more back at the beginning to the person that made the thing. Now, back when this was a big thing, and Walmart used to really hype this. Walmart had a fair amount, I should say, not Walmart, Whole Foods used to have a fair amount of stuff that was fair trade, including fruits and stuff. And they would make a big deal about that. Why did they quit doing that about 3 or 4 years ago? Feel free to be fairly cynical about this, by the way. If I'm Whole Foods and I'm selling apples and bananas, I've got a fair trade certificate on, so the bananas are 20 cents more than they cost at Foodland or Times, and the apples cost 40% more than Foodland or Times. What is, if I, and I'm in charge of the produce department, what am I going to find happens really quickly? What don't I sell very much of?
Of fair trade products.
Yeah, because everyone's going to go, oh, wow, yeah, that's fair trade. Yeah, they're 20 cents cheaper at times. Boom. And the whole thing. Americans think with their pocketbook. So the reality is fair trade is basically failing in the United States. It isn't failing in other areas. In Japan, people are actually quite conscientious about fair trade. If you go into Japanese markets, you'll see a fair amount of fair trade stuff. And Japanese are actually very willing to pay extra for that. And they just feel it's sort of, if they've got the money and the other person doesn't, it's a little bit of sort of feedback equity there. Americans just aren't willing to do it. It's one of the sadder aspects of the United States is we're just totally disinterested in equity. What we want to make sure is we get the maximum amount for the minimum cost. Walmart actually tried to do fair trade for about 3 years. And they actually have an interesting report, which I think you might still be able to find. But they just basically point out the American consumer does not care about ethics. The American consumer cares about getting the maximum amount for the minimum price, which of course is the Walmart stereotype. So even the companies that you would think of would be pretty sort of, bottom line mercenary have tried to do fair trade, and they just can't get Americans to buy into it. My view is that's because you've never educated. If you don't educate people what fair trade means, then why should they pay more for bananas? They don't know what it means. They just think Whole Foods is trying to screw them out of an extra 20 cents per pound of bananas. But the fact that there isn't more education given. For example, if you go to Japan, I know if you go in the stores, they'll actually tell you if you're buying something like, say, apples in Japan, there's actually a fair trade thing. They'll actually have a neat little placard usually there, which will tell you where they originally came from and give you an image of the village or wherever. It's probably sort of fake, but give you a village, an image of the people or the village that are going to get that money that you're paying the extra for. And I mean, me personally, I think that Americans would do that. If you actually showed where it was going to go back, they'd be much more liable to think about paying that extra money, because I think then they'd have a little bit of a guilty conscience about it. But fair trade is basically not working in the United States, and that has to be rethought. There's no reason it shouldn't work. I don't think Americans are that totally mercenary, at least I hope not, but at least it looks that way right now. So fair trade is something that's really interesting. It needs to be rethought, I think, but it is a way to basically provide a little more equity between the parts of the world that are the enormous consumers, because the United States basically consumes almost a quarter of the world's resources. And we're not that large a proportion of the planet. Let's see. Yeah, okay, let's do this way. Respect to Google again. Actually, let's use a place like this. Let's use Seattle. Okay, we'll say hypothetically, in fact, Walmart's one of the best that's actually started this in a really big way. We'll say that we're I don't know who I haven't picked on yet. Oh, okay. We'll say Bridget is actually the manager of a Walmart store here. I have no idea where here is. I'm just making this up. Now, if you drive by that store, one of the odd things you're going to notice, and this makes it very different than me, because my original background was in retail. I originally was, know these places. They used to be called Kmarts. I was a store manager, regional manager for Kmart way back before you guys were born. We used to have these massive warehouses attached to each of the stores. So it'd be a store, and in the back would be a big warehouse. And that's where you stashed all the stuff you're going to put in the store. So every month you basically go and order stuff that you're going to need 6 months or a year down the road. So for example, it's what, October now. Right now you'd be ordering, well, you would have ordered stuff for Christmas back in June. Right now you'd be ordering the stuff for Easter. And it will show up in a couple of weeks and be in the warehouse. So it's sitting in the back there. And then also when Easter shows up, bang, you've got all this stuff to put in the store. Now, if you go to Bridget's Walmart, you'll find that there is no warehouse. There's a little area in the back, but there's no warehouse. Now, Bridget needs stuff for Halloween. That's coming up. But she won't order it till, when is Halloween anyways? Like the 26th or something? I don't know. Who knows, right? Who cares? Well, we'll say hypothetically it's the 26th, so I can see it on the calendar here. If she's the manager, she'll probably order it Monday. So on the 12th, she's going to order stuff she needs to have in the store by the 21st. Okay. Now, what's she depending on is going to happen then between the 12th and the 21st? Especially if she's got an ad. If Walmart has some big ad plan, there's going to be all sorts of, Halloween candy on sale, come and get it starting on the 21st. What had she better have? Now, CVS is famous for screwing this up. What does she expect to see show up in her store probably around the 19th to the 20th?
Halloween products.
Yeah, a whole mess of containers driven up by trucks, and they drop the stuff off there, and everyone goes madly out and grabs all the stuff out of the containers, shoves them in the store, and bang, the Halloween stuff showed up. What doesn't she want to see show up on the 28th of October? All the Halloween products are supposed to be there on the 26th. Okay. This is what we call just in time. Walmart actually started this, which was the idea of basically they realized that telecommunications in the late 1990s, early 21st century was such that you could actually talk to a factory directly. So rather than the past where you just buy huge piles of stuff and stash them away and then sort of salt them out when you needed them, they realized that you didn't need to do that anymore. You could basically contact whoever makes candy and basically say, okay, and maybe in early October, say, okay, we need to have, 5 containers full of, candy to show up on this particular day. Since they've done this before, the factory would know in advance that this was probably going to happen, but they wouldn't know how much until you actually make the order. Then, because things move so quickly nowadays, they could literally just make that stuff in a couple of hours or maybe half a day, throw in the back of a bunch of containers, have those taken by rail or truck or something and driven out to the store and dropped off, and bang, you go. So you don't have to spend any time on warehousing the stuff. You don't have to stash it. You don't have to worry about it going bad or, cockroaches getting into it or something like that. You don't have to worry about any of that thing. You don't even have to have the staff or the folks that actually handle that stuff. You just get a bunch of grunts to basically take it out of the containers, just throw it in the store shelves. This is what we call just-on-time delivery. And it's basically how we do retail in the 21st century, but it didn't exist 20 years ago. So for example, CVS used to have a ton of warehouses. Longs used to have a ton of warehouses in Evelay and also down in Kapolei. They've gotten rid of all but one of them because now CVS orders everything to show up when they need it. Now, part of the problem that CVS gets into is, one, they're not particularly good at paying their bills apparently, but also they've got sort of a problem. You can sort of see it geographically. What's the problem if you're CVS in Honolulu and you're ordering stuff to get here for Halloween and you're trying to do what Walmart does? What's the big difference between being a Walmart store in Seattle ordering stuff from candy makers in the Western states and being that same store in Hawaii ordering stuff from the candy guys?
It has to be like shipped.
Yeah.
Like across the sea.
And because it's so expensive and you don't want to charge too much for it, it's going to have to be shipped by ocean, which means it could be anywhere from 4 days to 8 days, depending on how bad the sea conditions are. The boat's not going to go till the whole boat's full of stuff. They're not going to just ship like 10 containers on a boat that carries 3,000. So you're gambling that it's going to get here when you need it, but you can't be sure it's going to get here. And CVS is famous for having stuff show up late. It's not really well, it's sort of their fault, but it's also because CVS is based largely in California. They've never actually figured out that if you're 2,500 miles away from California, things don't work quite the same way because this thing called water in between. So when you look at this, we're actually a really good example of what happens when that doesn't work right. All of a sudden, everyone sort of goes kathunk, and it doesn't happen. Now, the next of these was what we call break in bulk. And this is actually the most famous example. Singapore is a really fascinating place. Just sort of a trivial note, Singapore actually doesn't have any reason for its existence. This whole section of the world was taken over by the British in the 1800s. So this is all part of a British colony called Malaysia. There was a little fishing town here, which I have no idea what the name was. You can go Google it, maybe. I don't know if anyone remembers. A British guy decided this would be a useful place to set up a town, largely to repair ships, because what you had is, of course, England's way the hell over here. I'm not going to bother zooming that far out. But here you go around India, you go all the way around Africa, and way over here in the far corner is England. Now, the British also had huge properties in this part of the world. So what was happening is a lot of stuff the English wanted was going, say, from China. It would sail down here. Now, the easiest way to get from here, this part of the ocean, from basically this part of the Pacific Ocean called the South China Sea, and to get into the Indian Ocean was to go through this little tiny squeeze spot here. Otherwise, you had to go through a huge, nightmare of places down around here. So the British set up shop and controlled this whole area. And they just, it was perfect for them. Because it very quickly dawned on them that they had two advantages. One is that not only was this a great place to repair boats because you were going to sail here or else you're going this way. So you got this, it's sort of like the world's largest truck stop. Secondly was if you decided there was someone you didn't like, you could just basically send out a few sort of aggro-looking guys with a boat and they could just put a cork and basically no one could get around here. So you could basically block everyone trying to get from this part of the world to this part of the world and vice versa just by controlling this one location. So the British built a town called Singapore. I have no idea where the word actually comes from. And by the late 19th century, it was one of the world's busiest seaports. The British gave up control of this whole region post-World War II. And the interesting thing is when they gave up control of this region, another thing popped in. We haven't really sort of seen this yet, but we'll see it again later. I'll just do it now because I'll forget. This part of the world is largely, the major population group is called Malay. And so not surprisingly, the country is now called Malaysia. One of the largest minority groups in Malaysia that moved in about 600 years ago was Chinese. And these were Chinese settlers from, I'll just shrink even further here, from here, that moved down in here to basically deal with trade in this part of the Pacific. And so what they did is they set up shop all along this eastern seaboard of Malaysia and became, important people in the various towns. Now, Chinese being Chinese, especially in this period, they didn't like Malaysians and they didn't interact with them. They made money off of Malaysians, but they didn't want to marry Malaysians. So your Chinese communities, this is true all throughout Southeast Asia, remain Chinese. There's tons of Chinese that have lived in, for example, Vietnam for the last 700-800 years. Same group actually from the same part of China as these guys. But they never intermarried with Vietnamese either. So Chinese, there's large numbers of Chinese scattered all throughout this region, but as of even today, they don't speak the language. The Chinese in Vietnam do not speak Vietnamese. They know Vietnamese, but they don't speak it at home. They still visibly consider themselves Chinese, and they still see themselves as being an entirely different culture from the country they've lived in for 800 years. Now, this was also true in Malaysia. In Malaysia, or in this part of the Malay Peninsula, the Chinese were, a big part of the group there. They were in charge of all the finances. They did all the trade, and they made lots of money. If you bought something, it was almost always from a Chinese store, but they never intermarried with the Malays, and they'd been there for hundreds of years. So when Malaysia becomes independent, the one group that the Malays decide they don't really want to have around, one is they wouldn't want the British around anymore because they're the guys that were in charge of the colony. Secondly is they decide they want the Chinese to get their ass out of town. Because they're tired of the Chinese having lived with them for all these years, being in charge of the banks, the money, the stores, and never basically spending that money with the rest of the population, but keeping it with themselves. Now, the Chinese, not being stupid, realized this was going to go bad really fast. So the vast majority of the population that's Chinese in Malaysia moves down here. So what you have is the country of Malaysia And this little section here, the cluster of islands around this little area of Singapore, which the British had set up, which always had a large Chinese population, hundreds of thousands of Chinese migrate from the rest of the Southeast Asian area and move to Singapore in the 40s and early 50s when these countries all gain independence, because they got to get out because they're afraid the locals are going to do a number on them. And in Vietnam, they did. In Vietnam, they actually imprisoned a lot of the Chinese, and in some cases executed them. So they were afraid the same thing was going to happen in Malaysia, so they got their butts out of town and they went and set up their own country of Singapore. So Singapore is a country that has a majority population of Chinese, but most of them haven't been to China in 300 or 400 years. And the country around them is a country of Malays. And of course, this part of the peninsula is part of Malaysia physically. Now, the reason that Singapore can remain independent is because of where it's located, the choke point. And the Singapore government, being really, really smart, realized very early on that there was one thing they could actually use. And I'll do this last image to show how this works. This is what makes Singapore one of the world's wealthiest countries. I think this is one of the new ones. I've never quite figured it out, but if you actually look at this thing, can you guys see this boat?
No.
Oh, it didn't show up. Oh, sorry. Okay, wait. There we go. So this will be your mystery for what, Tuesday? Okay, here's a container ship. The new ones that are being built right now, and I think this is one of the new ones, can carry 26,000 containers. Now, if you want to put in that context, my building, this building here, our behavioral science building, is one of the smaller containers. So each of these things is 40. These are the things you see the trucks run around with here in town. Each of these is 40 feet by, I can't remember what it's, 8 by 8 by 8 by 40 or something like that. 26,000 of these things full of stuff. Now, to put it in a context, we get about 5,000 containers for the Hawaiian Islands every week. And that's for everything for 1 million people. So if you just visualize how much crap you got on one of these suckers with 26,000 containers, and there's, I believe, over 20 of these boats that carry this many. Now, all this stuff gets put together somewhere. So in Vietnam or China or something like, they're filling up these containers with clothes, with iPhones, I don't care, whatever it is. Okay, then you're going to ship them somewhere else. So we'll say this thing might go to Europe, it might go to the United States, wherever. But you're going to have a huge problem. And we'll start next time with figuring out the nightmare that you're going to have if you have to deal with 26,000 containers. I'll give you a hint. We'll say each of these containers here in this one row, these are all iPhones. Okay. Now, given the fact, I don't know how many iPhones you sell, but each of the 40 by 8 by 8 is a hell of a lot of iPhones. Figures how many boxes of iPhones, and it's got to be a couple of, probably 5,000 or 10,000 per one of these things. We'll say it's about 100,000 iPhones just in this one row of containers. Now, one of the problems you're going to get is how do you get them to the people who want to buy them? And we'll sort of stop with that, because on one hand, containers do you some good, but containers are also sort of tricky. So we'll leave you with that. Also, if you want to entertain yourselves, it's really sort of, it's interesting when you actually look at pictures of these boats, it's hard to figure, oh, here we go. You sit there, and I mean, out of curiosity, once I actually tried counting the number of containers in these, because I just can't visualize how the hell you can have 20,000 containers in anything. If you ever go out to Sand Island, where the container yard is, they can only hold 4,000 containers there. And it looks like they got a mountain of that stuff. You start to count these things, and you suddenly realize by the time you go underneath, there's a lot of stuff in that boat. Okay, and there's roughly, I believe, 150 massive super containers running at any one particular time. Okay. So it's sort of mind-blowing when you look at the amount of stuff we consume on a daily basis and realize just we live in a world of containers. So we'll sort of stop with that, but the mystery is what we call break of bulk. And it's got some local relevance to it too. So we'll leave you with that mystery of what do you do with the containers? Okay, are we all set? We're all good for a Thursday?